At 11:47 p.m. on June 14, 1944, 8 days after the Allied invasion of Normandy, Sister Margaret Hale stood in the stone corridor of a requisitioned château near Bayeux, her white apron stained with blood that belonged to no particular flag. The building trembled with distant artillery, and kerosene lamps swayed on their hooks, casting restless shadows. A wet, rattling cough rose from the cellar where they'd placed the overflow cases, men too critical to move, too broken to categorize as anything but dying. Margaret lifted her lamp and descended the narrow stairs, her boots silent on stone, worn smooth by centuries of French wine merchants who had never imagined their vaults would become a sorting house for the wreckage of nations. The cellar smelled of carbolic acid, gangrene, and damp earth. 16 men lay on straw pallets in 2 rows, 8 British paratroopers on the left, 8 Wehrmacht soldiers on the right. Both groups wore the same hollow eyes that tracked movement but no longer registered hope. Margaret moved between them, checking pulses, adjusting tourniquets, whispering words that required no translation. "Easy now, you're safe, just breathe." And when she reached the source of the coughing, she found a young German corporal named Klaus Steinmann, his chest wound bubbling pink with every exhale. He was drowning in his own blood. She knelt and slipped her hand beneath his head, lifting him just enough to ease the pressure in his lungs. Across the cellar, a British lance corporal named Davies watched with feverish intensity, his left leg amputated just 6 hours earlier. "Why are you wasting time on him, sister?" he said, voice scraped raw by morphine. "He's the bastard who shot Wilkins." Margaret didn't let go of the German boy's wrist. She kept counting his pulse, 43 beats per minute, far too slow, and said quietly, "Wilkins is buried. This one isn't, not yet." She worked through the night, moving between rows, administering sulfur powder, cleaning wounds with boiled water and iodine. At 3:20 a.m., Steinmann stopped breathing. At dawn, when Captain Thornton arrived, a surgeon from Edinburgh whose hands never stopped shaking from too many amputations without anesthetic, he stood at the cellar stairs and said, "Sister Hale, this is irregular. Enemy wounded are supposed to be processed through POW channels." Margaret faced him, her uniform stiff with dried blood. "They were bleeding. I stopped it. If that's irregular, sir, then write me up." Thornton looked at the covered bodies, 2 British, 3 German. "The brass won't like it. Mixed wards, mixed care. Then they can come down here and sort them by uniform," Margaret said. "I'll wait." Thornton didn't write her up. Margaret worked for 73 consecutive hours, sleeping in 20-minute intervals on a stool between the 2 rows. On the 4th day, something shifted. She heard Davies speaking in halting German to the Wehrmacht sergeant in the pallet beside him. The German, a man named Kessler with a shattered pelvis, replied in fractured English, and the 2 enemies, separated by 18 inches of stone floor, began discussing tobacco. Margaret stood in the shadows and listened as Davies admitted he'd never actually smoked a pipe, and Kessler laughed, saying no German soldier had seen real tobacco since 1942, only ersatz garbage made from sawdust. By June 22nd, the cellar had become something that defied military taxonomy. Not a prison, not a hospital, but a suspended space where rank dissolved and nationality became irrelevant beside the shared fact of bleeding. The British paratrooper who learned to change a German's dressing because Margaret's hands were occupied elsewhere. The Wehrmacht machine gunner who held water to a British rifleman's lips. Men who had been trying to kill each other 9 days earlier now shared the same silence, the same nightmares, the same terror of infection. On June 29th, a brigadier named Walters arrived from 2nd Army headquarters, his uniform perfectly ironed, his moustache bristling with moral certainty. He descended into the cellar and said in a voice that could have frozen nitrogen, "Sister, this is a disgrace. You are treating enemy combatants with the same priority as His Majesty's soldiers. You are violating established protocols. Margaret set down the syringe she'd been preparing. "Brigadier, with respect, when a man is bleeding from a severed artery, I don't ask him which side of the channel he was born on. I tie off the artery." Walter's face turned the color of a bruised plum, but before he could reply, Davies sat up and said loudly, "Sir, if you're going to discipline Sister Hale, you'll need to discipline me too. She's the only reason any of us are still breathing." Across the aisle, Sergeant Kessler said in careful English, "This is true, Herr Brigadier. The sister, she does not see uniforms, she sees only wounds." The cellar fell silent. Walters stared at Davies, then at Kessler, then at the other men watching with identical expressions of exhausted defiance. "How many have you lost?" he asked Margaret quietly. 14 out of 63 admitted. "And if you'd triaged by nationality?" "I'd have lost more, because I'd have been playing favourites with time I didn't have." The brigadier climbed the stairs without another word. By mid-July, the château had processed over 200 wounded, Allied and Axis, mixed without ceremony. Germans began leaving their wounded where British patrols would find them sometimes with notes, "Bitte Krankenhaus bei Bayeux," and British medics quietly diverted them to the château because they'd heard Sister Hale didn't let men die for lack of a flag. On August 3rd, a German medical officer named Hauptmann Richter arrived, his right arm shattered by shrapnel. Margaret administered the last penicillin, officially reserved for Allied personnel only, and when Richter regained consciousness, he asked in fluent English why she'd wasted medicine on him. "Because the penicillin doesn't care who you are," Margaret said, "and neither does the infection." Richter studied her face. "You will be punished for this. Your army does not forgive those who blur lines." "Probably," Margaret said, and moved to the next patient. By August 19th, the château was being evacuated. Captain Thornton told Margaret she was being reassigned to Rouen. "They're burying what happened here, sister. No commendations, no recognition. Officially, this facility treated Allied personnel only." Margaret nodded. She'd expected nothing else. "But unofficially," Thornton continued, "every surgeon from here to Brussels knows what you did. And some are starting to ask why we don't do it everywhere, why we let men die in the name of paperwork." Margaret Hale returned to England and worked at East Grinstead until the war ended. She never spoke publicly about the cellar near Bayeux, never wrote a memoir, never sought recognition. After the war, she returned to Nottingham and resumed work as a district nurse. In 1953, she received a letter from Anton Kessler, formerly Sergeant Kessler Wehrmacht, now a schoolteacher in Düsseldorf. It said simply, "I am alive because you did not see a uniform. I have taught my students the same. Thank you." Margaret kept the letter in a drawer and never answered it, believing the work itself was the answer. The cellar near Bayeux was demolished in 1961. No plaque marks the location. But in military medicine archives, buried in footnotes, studies cite an irregular mixed treatment facility in Normandy that achieved a survival rate 11% higher than conventional segregated stations, a principle Margaret demonstrated without articulating that suffering recognizes no borders, and the only enemy medicine acknowledges is death itself. Margaret Hale died in 1987 at 74, quietly, in Nottingham. Her obituary mentioned her community service and noted she'd been a nurse during the war. It did not mention the cellar, the mixed rows, the British corporal and German sergeant who'd argued about tobacco while their stumps healed side by side. But in certain field hospitals years later, when young officers asked why protocols prioritized wound severity over nationality, older surgeons would mention a nurse in Normandy who treated bleeding as bleeding regardless of uniform, and they'd say that a tourniquet doesn't speak German or English, it only speaks the language of pressure and time, and in that language there are no sides, only wounds, only hands, only the choice to stop the bleeding or let it continue. Sister Margaret Hale made her choice without hesitation, without ceremony, and without asking permission from those who believed compassion required a flag to justify its existence. She simply tied off the arteries, dressed the wounds, and moved on to the next patient.